As the US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton visits Myanmar, will her trip encourage the country's rulers to continue down the path of democracy? Reforms in the long isolated country have surprised many, but do they indicate a real willingness to change, or are they just window dressing? We examine the challenges ahead. This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm James Bays. It's something many never expected to see. Hillary Clinton setting foot in Myanmar. It's the first visit by a US Secretary of State in more than 50 years. President Barack Obama said he sanctioned the visit because of what he described as flickers of progress by Myanmar's new leadership. Some say they're more than that and could be the initial steps in a historic transformation. Recent reforms in the country have surprised many observers. Some political prisoners have been freed, press restrictions have been eased, and trade unions are no longer banned. Analysts say that Clinton's trip comes at a time when the US is turning its focus to Asia, a move that's widely seen as an effort to counter Chinese influence in the region. The US Secretary of State has called her first official meeting with the leaders of Myanmar candid and productive. She said the US is encouraged by the steps the country has taken in recent months. But Clinton has repeated her call for all political prisoners to be released, and she's urged the President, Thein Sein, to make further reforms. Here's part of what she had to say.
So we're not at the point yet that we can consider lifting sanctions that we have in place because of our ongoing concerns about policies that have to be reversed. But any steps that the government takes will be carefully considered and will be, as I said, matched.
Many analysts have described Clinton's visit to Myanmar as a positive response by the US to a series of reforms by the country's leadership to end its isolation. Much has changed in just 1 year. First, there were national elections, the first in 2 decades. That was in November last year. Although the vote was dismissed as a sham by many, the new parliament chose former General Thein Sein as the country's president. Days later, the government released long-term political prisoner Aung San Suu Kyi from house arrest. Then in March of this year, the country's old military government was dissolved and its powers were transferred to a civilian government. 7 months later, in October, the new government established the Myanmar National Human Rights Commission, and that was followed by releasing dozens of other political prisoners. But one crucial question remains: do these developments mean that Myanmar really is heading towards democracy? It's been reported that in his meeting with Clinton, President Thein Sein discussed further changes. According to US officials, they include an effort to get a ceasefire in the war between Myanmar's military and ethnic minorities, granting media greater freedom, and adopting international agreements on nuclear programs to allay suspicions that the country may have been seeking weapons technology from North Korea. Let's discuss all this with our panel of guests. In London, we have Dr. Zarni, a visiting fellow at the London School of Economics. In Washington, D.C., we have Richard Weitz, who's senior fellow and director of the Center for Political Military Analysis at the Hudson Institute. And in Singapore, Maitrii Aung-Thwin, who is Assistant Professor of Southeast Asian History at the National University of Singapore. Welcome to you all. If I could start with you, Dr. Zarni, your assessment of the reforms in Burma, because obviously the US Secretary of State thinks that they're real reforms, otherwise she wouldn't have gone there.
No, I think we need to be very clear about why Hillary Clinton is there. Hillary Clinton is there not necessarily for the Burmese reforms. She is there to promote American interests vis-a-vis the Chinese growing power in the Asia-Pacific region. So we really have to nail that down to sort the spin from the real intent behind the US Secretary of State's trip to Burma.
Maitrii, your view on these reforms? We'll look at them in some detail, but do you think they are real reforms or just window dressing?
I do think they are real reforms. I think this is the reason why the Secretary of State has visited, and I think this also is a recognition not only of the changes that have occurred in the last year, but these are a reflection of the changes that have been occurring in the last 20 years that have made the opening of this political landscape possible in the first place. So I think this is quite a significant event. It also involves some of the issues that Dr. Zarni has also raised. So I think it's a much more complicated picture than it might appear in the first place.
Richard in Washington, President Obama has spoken of flickers of progress, but the Americans must see more than flickers for the Secretary of State to go all the way there to Myanmar.
Well, that is correct, that presumably they have some indication, either from communications from the Burmese and the opposition or other sources, that it's possible that there will be a reform program. Now, Al Jazeera and other shows have been showing us very clearly that these reform processes in the Arab world and presumably in Asia as well, it's very complicated. You have many actors. Some people might want to reform. Some people want to go different directions. So this is by no means certain. It is clear, though, that there are some people in the Burmese leadership who want to make some reforms, and perhaps that was one of the purposes of the visit, was for Secretary Clinton to get on the ground, talk with people, and with her whole entourage, get a better sense of what's happening in a country which is often difficult for us to follow here in Washington.
Want to just raise one little issue, which is the name of the country, Richard. You call it, like the Americans all call it, Burma. The government call it Myanmar. Zarni, if you can tell us, it's rather interesting, I think, to watch the pictures coming in. The Secretary of State, when she's there, is obviously not trying to offend anyone. She hasn't actually named in any of her speeches or anything she's said, she hasn't named the country she's in. Is that interesting?
Well, yeah, it is very interesting. I think she's been thoroughly briefed over, whether or not that she should use the word Myanmar, which the Burmese generals would have liked her to do, or stick with the American position, which is to keep calling it Burma as a symbolic objection. I lived in Burma for 25 years under the first Burmese dictatorship, which was very much in with the United States. And, General Ne Win was invited to White House in 1964. He wined and dined in London with, the British dignitaries and leaders, including the Queen Elizabeth at Buckingham Palace. And so this isn't really the Burmese coming out of the 50 years of diplomatic isolation and then trying to re-embrace the West. And so I think there is this another layer to, what is happening now. Basically, in the old Cold War scenario, the Burmese dictatorship was embraced, and for 25 years, over the past 24 years or so, the dictatorship was no longer convenient to or expedient to the Western interests. And now what we're seeing is the emergence of a new Cold War between U.S. and allies and China on one side. And then so I think like that Burma is playing into that, the larger, strategic objective of the United States and the West.
Do you think, Maitrii, that it is possible that what the generals are trying to do here is get rid of their pariah status, and then when they've made some reforms, they'll sit back and then try and get economic gain from China, from India and the US and play one off against each other, that this is just a ploy?
Well, I think it's important to look at this from perhaps an immediate perspective and a more long-term perspective. From an immediate perspective, there is a real agenda to try to engage the international community in a way that perhaps will enable economic reforms and sanctions to be lifted and the regularization of diplomatic relations with nations like the US. In terms of long-term perspectives, I think that the leadership has had been able to reflect on the last 50 years of civil war and poor economic planning and realized, especially in the early 90s, that they have to change. There's no way they can actually survive, and then the people can't survive as well, unless they try to make the hardcore everyday issues, socioeconomic issues, their priority. They need to put roofs on people's heads, put people in schools, improve health care, provide jobs, many of the things that many other countries in the world are concerned about right now. While ideology and politics are very important, at the core of the issues, I think, right now that the generals and the government are interested in is reforming social economic institutions in order to bring the country's economy back up to the 21st century.
Dr. Zarni, there was one interesting quote that I read in the last few days, which is in the Financial Times. It says, in political makeover terms, the generals have had a facelift, a nose job, and several rounds of Botox. Is that how you see this? This is all cosmetic?
Oh, I mean, I wouldn't say entirely cosmetic, but definitely, you know, like primarily what is driving the reform efforts, like to the extent that there are reforms on the agenda, it's really self-interest. You know, there are a number of things that converge that create this new opening. One definitely is the Arab Spring, and they know how different Arab tyrannical regimes tumble and ended rather miserably, like Libya or like Egypt, Mubarak. And I think like they're taking lessons from a distance in terms of how to manage the popular expectations in terms of what the government should do. But cosmetic change is actually a very, very accurate word, because there is no change of word, no change of heart as far as the Burmese generals. They see themselves as paternalistic guardians of the nation. And, what's interesting is that they are reversing the strategy that they used back in 1990s when they came out of the popular uprising, having crushed it in 1988. In the past, they tried to persecute the Burmese ethnic majority led by Aung San Suu Kyi and the dissidents, and ignoring the election that they themselves held in 1990. And now the opposition has become very, very weak. I mean, I'm talking about the opposition led by Aung San Suu Kyi doesn't have the kind of like Arab spines, and so we're not seeing the popular uprisings on the streets. And so the generals decided that this is the best time to make peace with Aung San Suu Kyi and then zero in on the minorities who live in extremely resource-rich and strategic border areas with China, India, and other places.
OK, well, Zarni, we'll talk about those minorities a little later. But I'd like to ask Maitrii about one of the reforms that's been trumpeted by the government there, and that is the release of political prisoners. They have released political prisoners, but there are many more still in jail, aren't there?
There are indeed. I think one of the most important releases, of course, was Aung San Suu Kyi, whose release, I think, really signaled a change in the political landscape. I think with her release and her agreement to engage in dialogue with the representatives of the government, it really opened up a new space for not only the stakeholders in Myanmar to take part in discussing the possibilities for future reform, but it also provided a space for the United States to come in. Because prior to this, the positions held by many of the stakeholders, both within the government and within the opposition groups, were quite hard-lined. But there's been a shift in the political climate. They're taking more moderate stances, and this has enabled, within the last year, the U.S. to come in. I'm pretty optimistic, actually, about her role in the future of the reform program. And I can't help but think that the issue of political prisoners may be resolved in a few years to come.
Richard, can I ask you about political prisoners? Because isn't what the government in Myanmar, what they're doing here, is using these political prisoners as a sort of bargaining chip? And should the Secretary of State have waited until they'd all been released before travelling there?
Well, that could be a very long time, and so I don't know if that was even considered as an option. But you asked a very good question earlier about whether this is window dressing, and maybe, and this of course is part of that whole question about how significant is the release of the prisoners. And I think there are probably the generals, a lot of them are trying to do that, trying to gain enough international legitimacy through some gestures to sustain themselves in power. But of course, they're not the only actors. It's a strategic situation. They have their strategy, we have our strategy, the Burmese opposition has their strategy, and so on. So they may have that objective, they may have that plan, but whether it actually works, it depends on a lot of other factors they can't control. And again, Al Jazeera and other news media have been helping us understand that these dynamics in the Middle East, that you might have limited reforms and then they start snowballing and the leaders lose control and they end up with an entirely different situation. And we've seen this, of course, elsewhere in the world as well.
Dr. Zarni, this was one of the most repressive regimes in the world. Do you think some of these repressive practices will be entrenched in the culture of the security forces, and it'll be hard, whatever anyone says, to stop that way of working?
Well, I mean, to a degree, yes. I think, like, the culture of persecution and the cultural fear will continue on, from like 2003 then until 2008. I was working on what is called citizens diplomacy, track 2 in technical term, working with like 2 different heads of intelligence of the Burmese military, General Kim Yun, who was sacked in 2004, and then his successor, General Min Sui, who is a top 10 general there. And, I had private conversation with these guys, and, I would be very cautious about taking reform measures in Burma at face value, having known them personally and having come from the military background, larger extended family of military officers in my clan. And I think I would say that they are making reform efforts so that they can reinvent themselves in a more acceptable form. And earlier, like
Dr. Zarni, they have said that they're appealing to those living abroad to come home, to dissidents. I don't know if you consider yourself a dissident. Would you feel safe to fly back there now?
I was the very first dissident who broke with Aung San Suu Kyi's sanction policy as early as 2003. And I gave up my U.S. asylum in 2005, and I went home as a guest of General Maung Zarni, who was at the time number 2 in the country. I stayed in the military guest house for almost a month and a half for 2 times, and then so I was one of the very first one to return home, even before this, talk of going home became fashionable. And would I go home now? No. I want to see the rule of law in place. I want to see the, genuine, move towards democratization. That would include, from my perspective, 2 things clearly. One is cessation of military operations against ethnic minorities that make up 40% of the country's population. And second is the release of all political prisoners. Hillary Clinton said over 1,000 political prisoners are behind bar. And President Thein Sein categorically denied in Bali about 10 days ago there was such a thing as political prisoners. And so
Maitrii, I'd like to discuss those issues with you. We talked about the political prisoners, but this ongoing conflict that has been going on for 60 years now with the ethnic minorities, a really brutal war.
It's a very serious challenge that has more or less determined the political landscape, as you said, for the last 60 years. While other countries in the region were able to concentrate on economic reform and infrastructural development, the Burmese were having to try to keep the country together, more or less. At least that was the official position, struggling with armed insurrection, and so they weren't able to concentrate on the types of reforms that clearly they have an opportunity to do now. And so, yes, the relationships with the ethnic groups need to continue. They started in the mid-90s, bringing several groups to the negotiating table. That was a positive sign. Many became part of the National Convention. Those who decided to wait and see, perhaps these groups may come to the table now that the U.S. has shown a stronger interest and a commitment in the political future. It is definitely one of the major hurdles that's facing this country. And so it's going to be very much a priority to not only resolve the ethnic issue, but also to resolve the social economic conditions that are underneath these issues as well.
Richard,
Maitrii,
okay, go ahead, Zarni. Go ahead, Zarni.
Let me jump in, like a 2 issue. We need to ask the question, why are the ethnic minorities in rebellion for 60 years? Because, Burma was released from the clutch of British colonialism in 1947-48, but the minorities felt that they were released into the hands of the Burmese nationalists who do not want to honor the promise of ethnic equality in a post-independence country. That was the number one reason the ethnic rebellion has continued on. And if ethnic equality is enshrined in the Constitution and inscribed in the political landscape of the country, rather than military primacy is enshrined in the Constitution as it is today, then
Richard,
the ethnic
can I ask you
minority
about
issue
this
is not a problem.
and the ongoing war that's going on and the tactics of the military in this war? We have pillage, we have forced labour, we have brutality, we have systematic rape. This is going to be of great concern to the US and Hillary Clinton.
Yes, that is one of the objectives. And I think it's clear that there are multiple objectives of this visit. One, we talked about promote political and other reforms. Two, to end the conflicts with the ethnic groups insofar as that's, and again, what the U.S. can do itself is limited, but these are the goals, to promote that. And then, as was mentioned in the beginning, and is probably the most important reason, is to try and make sure that Burma itself moves a bit further from China and North Korea. And insofar as the U.S. engages with Burma, it's also helping to send a message to Vietnam, the Philippines, and other countries in East Asia that the U.S. is committed to working with the governments there as we all try and manage the rise of Chinese power, which may or may not become threatening to us. We don't know, and it's an open question, but it's sort of something that as long as the U.S. is active in all these countries, including Burma, it just sends a signal that everybody understands that the Chinese are encouraged to continue what have so far been relatively moderate foreign policies.
Can I ask you, Zarni, about that? I can understand why the Americans would want to disengage the government from the Chinese, but what's in it for the authorities there in Myanmar? Why would they want to distance themselves from China now?
Well, head of the Burmese intelligence back in 2006 told me in a one-on-one, an hour-long conversation with me. He said, look, we're trying to secure our country's interest. We don't have any permanent enemies or permanent friends, only permanent interest of the country. So they want to have the best of all worlds, and so that is in and of itself, that logic is not a problem because we are a small country, resource-rich, strategically located, sandwiched between two major Asian giants, India and China. So and the U.S. has also interests, and so does Japan and South Korea for different reasons. So the small country trying to play different great powers to gain national interest is not a problem. It is the best strategy approach. But the problem is, will the Burmese public concretely benefit from this strategy, or will this strategy further entrench and enrich the already entrenched and rich, Russian oligarch-like regime? If you look at the Burmese economy, 90+% of the economy is in the hands of the generals and their, cronies. And so, when someone else talks about, say, socioeconomic reforms, how do you reform or improve a socioeconomic condition when 90% of the country's economy and wealth is concentrated in a handful of generals and their cronies?
Maitrii, can I ask you about that? It's been described as the last untapped market in Asia. If it's opened up, is it going to benefit all of the people in this country?
It's very difficult to say, given that the infrastructure is quite poor. And I'm not sure if 70% of the population, which is rural, is going to have access to that direct type of investment, for example, if the economic sanctions are lifted. But I can say that that with the interest in the country, having more investors, whether it's just Chinese having more investors coming in from the West, following perhaps the U.S., will hopefully be a good thing for the people of Myanmar. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to be able to access that, but we have to start somewhere. I realize that most of the wealth has been concentrated within a particular few, which is not unlike other countries. But I think that with the opening of the economy, it perhaps might open a space for a diversification of the economy, so that perhaps not within the next 10 years, but within the next 50 years, we might see a growing middle class that's able to diversify not only the political views, but the economic views as well.
Thank you, Maitrii. Thanks to all our guests, Dr. Zarni, Richard Weitz and Maitrii. You've now had the inside story on Myanmar. Thank you so much for spending your time with us. Remember, as ever, the email, it's insidestory@aljazeera.net. Your comments, criticisms, ideas and thoughts, send them all to us. I'll see you soon. Bye-bye now.